Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Claire Robertson from the Weinberg Group, and I will be moderating this presentation titled Advisory Committees. It all comes down to this. The Weinberg Group is the leading food and drug consultancy with headquarters in D.C. as well as an office in San Francisco. The speaker on today's webinar is Matthew Weinberg, Chief Executive Officer at the Weinberg Group. Mr. Weinberg guides all of our strategic issues management client efforts with an emphasis on providing strategic and operational assistance to technically oriented entities in areas such as research and development, regulatory affairs, and quality assurance. Matthew's assignments have also included strategic development of new products, testimony on the management and economics of scientific enterprises, and contract issues and product development. During the course of today's presentation, you will be able to submit questions to be answered by Mr. Weinberg at the end of the presentation. We will try to answer as many questions as possible today. However, if we are unable to get to all of them, we will email the answers along with the slides within a week. With that, we will begin the webinar.
Hi, it's Matthew Weinberg, and thanks for taking the time to listen to our webinar on advisory committees today. I know Claire was kind enough to introduce me, but I'd like to take just a couple of seconds and talk about why we decided to do a webinar on advisory committees. Admittedly, there are not that many of them. On the other hand, if you have one or preparing for one, you recognize its importance. And the reason we decided to do this is because, frankly, I think an awful lot of time is wasted as companies get ready for advisory committees. And in fact, if you think about it, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which gets to strategy and use of science, also flows through to the entire process of preparing regulatory submissions. But for the purposes of today, we're going to focus just on advisory committees and their impact. And they're expensive. Let's be honest. If you've gotten to this point, you've spent a lot of money and you have a lot at risk. And there's a key hurdle that comes to play when it gets to advisory committees. They're really the last place you'll have an opportunity to speak for yourselves, say what you want about your drug, and hope that you'll get the blessing that needs to go forward. A lot of money is frequently spent on the mechanics of how one prepares for an advisory committee. When we're asked, for example, to bid on a RFP for an advisory committee, frequently people ask us about is what slide techniques we're going to use, what presentation software we're going to use. And while all that's important, it is by no means the most important. And yet I think it gets way, way, way too much focus in this world. The key to an advisory committee is to understand not only how much is at stake, but how much power is in the hands of the sponsor. And where we're going to go today is to discuss first how the advisory committee works, and secondly, what the Weinberg Group thinks is the appropriate approach to take when preparing for one. Before I do that, I want to make one point. It is obvious, but maybe not always said, that failure to behave correctly and appropriately in preparing for an advisory committee has massive consequences, has an impact on stock value across the spectrum of firms that present to them. And it's not always just new products that make it in front of an advisory committee. Often FDA uses such a committee because it has concerns over a product, or there's public outcry over safety, or really the FDA is using it because they want to get some public comment. So we're going to talk today about how sponsors can manage this process, put themselves in a position of control, and hopefully, and this is of course assuming the data support it, get the positive outcome that they would like to have. From our standpoint, an advisory committee approval is really only possible if wisdom, science, and intelligent preparation is put together. This is a challenge because a lot of people spend a lot of time and a lot of resources, and frankly, not everybody does this as smartly as they can. Some firms do it very well. I've seen smaller firms, some of whom are our clients, spend the time, get that first product approved, and have the absolute appropriate celebration when they're done. And I've seen others who spend a lot of time without having the thought process that goes into it. So let's start with really what's important, and it all starts with this. Good science presented well wins. That's always been true in the FDA universe. It will always be true in the FDA universe. For us, You got to be able to answer the questions that the panel asks. You have to be able to do so quickly and demonstrate the safety and wisdom behind your product. You want to be able to demonstrate quickly the medical value, and you need to be flawless. This is where the presentation part comes in, but it is secondary to the data. If you don't have good data, you're not going to go anywhere. If you have good data and put it in a bad light, you're not going to be going anywhere. And while that may seem silly to do, you'd be shocked at how often it happens. So let's take a couple of minutes and just go over some simple rules. And that's where I'm going to start. Everybody wants to make this complicated, and it is not. It is an axiom of every presentation I've ever given in my life and every advisory committee that we've ever done. You want to keep it simple. This is not the time to impress the FDA and the associated scientists with how smart you are. Yes, undoubtedly you are geniuses, but the truth is they don't care. What they care about is how good is your product, what in fact it's going to have on the public, and how much difference you will make. So what does that mean? The mean is make it easy for them to say yes. Rely on your data, but keep it simple. Don't overdo this. Don't underdo this. But by God's sake, don't overdo it. Too much information. Make it complicated. All you do is raise questions. And the goal of this process, let's just remember this from the beginning, is simple and make it easy for the committee to say yes. The advisory committee's process is built on the same scientific process most of us learned many years ago. It's predicated on the fact that you've done experiments, you have data, and you can demonstrate the impact of your product. Frankly, it doesn't matter if that product is a drug or a device or a combination product. It really makes no difference whatsoever. At the end of the day, you have to demonstrate its safety and efficacy. Committee members come from a broad array of backgrounds, industries, and frequently knowledge. FDA will often add a couple of people to a panel because they think those folks bring in some specific knowledge about the products to be reviewed that day. Could be a toxicological issue, could be a pharmacokinetic one, could be a use in the community, an academic expert on the particular disease that the product is intended to affect. Therefore, you've got to make it simple for them, as we said before. Each member will have a pet concern. You should know that in advance. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Success and failure, this cannot be overemphasized in this webinar enough, rests on your ability as the sponsor to simply control the meeting. How can you do that? We'll talk about that when we get to mechanics. But I want you to think about this from the beginning. It's your presentation. We're keeping it simple. We're moving forward. But you are going to control the meeting. And the meeting is designed really quite easily for you to do that. The committee focuses on risk-benefit relationships. Frankly, so do you. I probably think that since the beginning of when you started with this product, that's precisely what you were pondering. What's the risk-benefit relationship going to be? How are we going to be able to figure this out so that we make sure that this product delivers significant benefit over whatever risk it brings? So we know there's risk because all the products in our industry have some risk. So we're not going to fool ourselves and say there's none. We have to make sure that the committee correctly understands the relationship between the two. Once we do that, then we can start to talk about the therapeutic value over and over and over. We want to make sure that they're not focused unnaturally or unnecessarily on the risks, but we do want to make sure that they understand most of all the therapeutic value this will bring, because if there are people who are treaters on the panel, they're going to be talking about what it is the patients need. Those are the ones who are going to most understand why therapeutic value matters. They're also going to be the first who are going to say, wait a minute, I can't make my patient worse off. If I'm buying them a month of survival time, what's that month worth at what cost? If it's somebody who has a life-threatening disease, can we turn that around? And what's the risk going forward? And then we'll be able to manage this process, think our way through it, present the strategy so they can see the wisdom in approving our product. Now, I've said this and I'll say it over and over again, and I apologize in advance a little bit because some of this webinar is somewhat repetitive. It's on purpose. Not because I didn't have enough words to say, because I probably always do, but the truth is that we want to hammer home some points, and so we've made them on purpose. This meeting depends solely on the sponsor. Yes, FDA calls the meeting. Yes, they put together the panel. But you have in your hands the ability to control how this works. Good data trumps bad, but you can present good data poorly and have things go downhill. By the same token, you can occasionally present bad data well and put it in the right context. On the whole, we're going to assume that if you've made it to an advisory committee for approval, the odds are you have good data. If your product's up under attack, the kind of data you have is also going to make a difference. We also know that every single member, as I said before, has a pet peeve. No doubt about it, or a pet project, or a pet angle, or something like that. You need to know those, and we'll talk about that later, how you figure it out. But you need to know them and be prepared to talk to it. If you know that somebody's focused on a particular pharmacokinetic issue, then you have to be able to respond to that in your talk. You want to quiet those demons down before they rear their ugly head against you. You have to tell your story well, and that's what this is. We're telling a story. We're not making a presentation. We're telling a story. We're telling a story about how smart our product is going to be for the masses. And by masses, I don't mean that in a negative way, but you mean other than the folks that were in your clinical trial. We can't put this any other way. We can't, for have failure, spend far too much money and far too much time to get to this point. So we have to think as the sponsor, how do I control this meeting? What do I need to do to make sure things go my way? How do I do everything in my power to bring this to the point of fruition where I'm going to get the approval I so richly deserve? Luckily, there's a way to do that, and it's what I call the intelligent presentation. Not every presentation is intelligent. Hopefully this one is, but not every presentation is intelligent. The way to do this in advance is by thinking. Now, I know everybody always says thinking's overrated or we don't have enough time to do it. But here's the beauty of this. You absolutely always have the time with an advisory committee to think. No one ever gets called the day before an advisory committee and said, hey, guess what? You're up tomorrow. Usually you have months. Even if you had 30 days, you have the time it takes to figure it out in advance. You get to decide what parameters, what data, what method, and who is going to present this. You have to make it easy for them to say yes, and the way you do that is by designing a strategy that allows the committee to say yes. Now, obviously, that's the challenge, and we're going to go through this. Now, one last point I want to make before we get to some of the methodology here is that this favors you. Normally, I'm not going to say always, because we all know that occasionally the FDA gets to do things their way, and that's okay. But normally, the sponsor gets to go first. When the sponsor puts on their case, they get to make the strongest case for why their product should be approved or marketed or kept on the market, whatever it is that the committee is there to do. Rebuttal happens afterwards. Then get a chance to comment post-rebuttal. But if we do a really good job up front, then we know, no doubt about it, but then we know that we've imprinted upon the minds of the committee members exactly what it is we want them to do. And we'll have rehearsed so much, and we'll have hopefully maybe even had a couple of mock panels, but we will know that once we do that, we will be smooth and exactly where this needs to go. The key is to never lose control, and I've seen it. Right? I describe this, and we'll talk this a little bit when we talk about prepackaged rebuttals, but I've seen committee meetings devolve into what I call the feeding frenzy of sharks. A little crack in the data opens, and everybody jumps into that fray to get their little piece of the action. I've been at meetings like that. Unfortunately, we've had clients who have gone that way, clients who should never have been allowed to present to the meeting, but FDA wanted to make sure that that product would never see the light of day. And so by using an advisory committee to shut it down, they had the strength of not having to say no themselves. That is a way that probably about 20 years ago was the last time I saw something that egregious. But these poor folks literally were just destroyed because they had cracks in their armor. They knew they had cracks in their armor, and there wasn't anything they could do about it. These days, we all got a lot smarter, and we're a lot more prepared. Now, what I'd like to do now is take the balance of this webinar and go through what I call the Weinberg Group approach. And I figure as the CEO of the Weinberg Group, that's a fair place for me to be. Our approach has been put together, predicated on multiple advisory committees in which we have assisted clients. You'll notice, as I said before, none of this relies on the mechanisms of what software program to use or what presentation materials to use, because all that can come later. What matters up front is, what are you going to say? Because if you don't know what you're going to say, how you're going to say it really doesn't make a difference. I don't care if you have the best, prettiest slides in the world. If there's garbage on them, you're not going to get approval. I don't care if you use the smartest presenters in the world. They don't have the right words, it's not going to make a difference. So let's take a few moments here and figure out precisely how to get the right words onto each slide. Two principles guide the Weinberg Group as we go through this, and in fact guide this particular process. One is strategy, two is presentation. And by presentation, again, I don't mean the software, I mean the mechanics of who's going to speak and what they're going to say. The first thing I want to focus here on is strategy, something actually I think is frequently overlooked. I think a lot of folks put stuff together based on the way their regulatory filings are written, and I'm not so sure that's always the best way to do it. You also notice that on step 4, I've said rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. You cannot rehearse enough. You just can't. I don't care if you've done it 100 times, 101 is better. If you have the capacity, if you have the time, mock panels matter, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Not everybody has the time or money to do that, but no matter what you do and no matter to who the presenters are, you still got to rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. And so that's sort of our overriding. Now let's talk a little bit about strategy. Step 1 in the strategy is to look at your data as if you were looking at it for the first time. That's hard to do if you're the folks who've written it. And obviously, as the CEO of a consulting firm, I'm going to advocate using outside consultants. But let's not fool ourselves. I understand not everybody does. But you have to look at yourselves as if you were the people reading this data, as if you were the advisory committee yourself. You know this data cold. They do not. You know exactly what the strong and weak points of your case are. They do not. So you have to take this as if you're the naive reader looking at this for the first time. And that naive reader may need to see things in a different format than it's presented before. And that's where all of this starts. So start looking at your application all over. Look at the pharmacology, the statistical, the clinical results. Look at every little facet of this to be able to figure out what works for us and what doesn't. And put yourselves, walk a mile in your shoes of the committee. Think to yourself, okay, I understand I'm on this committee. I'm coming in on an airplane probably the night or maybe 2 nights before. It's one of the first times I'm going to be looking at the data. What do I need to see? That will help you form your strategy. What's the key elements of your case that need to be made both strong and weak? Let's not fool ourselves. We don't want to sit there and just tell the strong parts, because the weak parts will come up and hurt us. The other thing we want you to understand is, what's your business objective? What is it you're willing to take? What is it you're not willing to take? You're willing to take a follow-up study. You know, is your objective to get on the market? And I say this, and everyone's going to say, well, of course our objective is going to be to get on the market. Well, it's a funny thing. We once did an advisory committee where we had a client who said to us, look, I care that I get approval. But if this committee votes against me, I want them to vote against me in a way that will make sure no one will ever get approval. And they were very concerned about the methodology of somebody coming up behind them and picking off this disease state while they were trying to figure it out. And what they wanted to do was to make sure, in this particular case it was the clinical study that they had done that they were afraid would be too small. They wanted to make sure that if the committee said no, the committee advocated for such a large clinical trial that it was obvious nobody would ever undertake one. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened to this client. They did not get approval, and the committee picked a 22,000-person clinical trial. To this day, it's never happened. There are other ways that there are other indications by which this product got on the market, which is okay with our client, but we achieved the goal of not getting it approved and making sure nobody else would either. Now, that's not normal, but it does mean understanding what you're willing to take and where you want to go with this, because that, like everything else, shapes your strategy. You also need to figure out what it is you're going to highlight. Are you going to highlight the disease state? You know, what are your clinical endpoints? And while they may be, in sometimes the one you've used for FDA, there may be other ones that you want to highlight as well. And that makes a big difference. So you got to know where you want to go. Step 2 in figuring out what's critical about the data is it's all about the science. It's always about the science. If you want to figure out the strategy, prove the science. Rely on the science. Rely on the data. Figure out the medical value of the product you're trying to present. What's it worth to the patient population? Not only in terms of, I guess I would put it this way, in terms of the raw clinical results, put it out there. Make it obvious this is necessary. Why do people need this? Because if they don't, what's going to happen? You've got to put it out there. You've got to understand the key message points that you need to make this product so necessary the committee has no choice to say yes. And be honest. Always be honest. Let's not leave anything out. I find a lot of presentations, folks go into this and they say, got to be a little careful here. We want to highlight this risk. We want to highlight that risk. I promise you FDA will if you don't, and you don't want somebody else to own your issues. Own your own issues. Because when you do that, you can put them in the right context. When you put them in the right context, it frames it and makes it a lot easier. Remember, you go first. You get to shape the view of this product unlike anybody else. You get to name your own risks as well as your own benefits. You have the knowledge. It's all in your accumulated head. You've got to make sure that the brilliance you have and the wisdom and knowledge you have gets demonstrated to the committee. They have to understand the wisdom of approving this product. That's how you get them to say yes. And that's where your strategy comes into play. You build a strategy that says, okay, here's the wisdom behind our product. It proves, it cures this disease, that disease, it makes this patient better off. We have seen these kinds of outcomes. These are the changes in our patients' lives. All of those are the kinds of examples you want to make. We want to be able to distill on a little bit of a basis the numbers into normalcy. We want to be able to say, we have changed people's lives, here's the data. We've been able to do some with a modicum of risk, here's the data. We want to be able to take that and look at it very simply so that we can say, this is why you have to approve this product. And the strategy then is based on presenting the strong points and the weak points, and we have to frame them. Sometimes, there's no hard and fast rule as to which goes first. It really depends. I generally prefer to lead with my strengths, follow with my weaknesses, and conclude with my strengths. There's a whole concept out there in management called the criticism sandwich. Well, I think of this as the advisory committee sandwich. Right? I want to start with what I'm good at, stick in the middle what's not so great, and then cover the back end with why this makes so much sense. If I can do that, then as the sponsor, I've done my job, and I'm ready to do it. There has to be, you can't put this in the hands of one person. I know in a lot of smaller companies, particularly, there's somebody whose job this is, but that's a mistake. Advisory committees are not one mind, which means you can't have one mind think of your strategy. You really ought to take 4, 5, 6 hours sometimes, go off site, take a couple of days, figure out what your strategy should be and think this forward. It can't be a single person. And I know I've spent 3 slides now on the strategy, and I'll tell you why. If you don't have good strategy, none of the rest matter. So take the time, as I said on the outset, to think. The final product really ought to be, could be bullet points, could be paragraphs, but you really have to write down, just as you would a business plan, a strategic plan for the presentation of this advisory committee. Now, we've talked about this with clients in the past, and some folks say, well, that's a lot of work. And I would say, yes, that's true, but it's nowhere near as much work as it took you to get this far. And as we said on a previous slide, failure simply is not an option at this point. Now, if you're even in the case of where my client said they were happy to have a negative vote, that still wasn't a failure to them because they achieved sort of a marketing goal of not letting anybody else into that space. And it wasn't a huge therapeutic benefit. It was just a particular issue, we'll call it, that they needed to resolve. Now, it's very, very important that everybody look at this. Think this through. Think of it from both sides. Sometimes call someone, maybe if you have a consultant hasn't been involved, let them look at the strategy after you figured it so they can look at it sideways. because that's how everybody else is. Remember, you're presenting this to a somewhat naive population. They don't know as much as you do. And like anything in that realm, you have to think, how will they see it? Walk a mile in the receiver's shoes, and you'll be a whole lot better off. Then you can begin to script the slide-by-slide outlines, because that's the next step. Once you've put together your strategy, then you begin to start thinking about what is each slide-by-slide outline. Now, as I said before, we want to sort of do this in that sandwich method, or think about which presentations we want to look at to optimally position the product. What I find a lot of folks do is they sugarcoat the risks, and I don't think you should do that. I think you ought to be honest about the risks. You also have to figure out what FDA is going to say. Because if, again, you can own those issues. So you've had a whole review process with them. You've had meetings with them. You know what they care about. You know what worries them. Well, own that. Figure out the answer to it. Come up with the rebuttal. Figure out right now so that when you make your first presentation, FDA is taken out of the picture. And I don't mean that in a negative way, because we all know we need the agency. But the point is, you should own the data. So if you know that FDA is going to raise issues about hepatotoxicity, be prepared to address it before they do. Be prepared to bring up the hepatic toxicity issues and think through what they're going to be. Think through what the tolerance are going to be on the kidney. Think through how this is going to impact red blood cells. I have no idea, obviously. It depends on your product. But make a difference so that you're owning the issue. That's a key part of any strategy and any presentation. Then structure this so we lead the committee through a logical progression of what's good about the data, what's bad about the data, what's good about the data. It's not haphazard. And I'll tell you something right now, and I'm going to say this again in a second when I get to presenters. Ego is irrelevant. There's an awful lot of companies that we all work for, many of us, I'm sure some of my staff would probably say the same thing, where the guy running the company has a pretty big ego. That's great. This is not the time where ego matters. The right people make the right presentations in the right order. If you have somebody who needs to be out in front, but they're not the right person to be out in front, you got to tell them they're not the right person to be out in front. They have to be fluid speakers who know the data. They have to be people who are smart but slotted in the right place. And that's, again, go back to your strategy. What's our case? What's our presentation order? How are we going to make it easy for these guys to say yes? Because we're going to lead them down the logical path of why the data demonstrate that this product needs to be on the market. So I just finished saying what the banner on this says, which is the presentation leads committee members to acceptable outcome. The real critical piece of this is to not let a feeding frenzy occur. Yes, they have questions. Yes, they'll have legitimate questions, and you need to be prepared to answer them. The data is critical, but so is an intelligent presentation. And only intelligent data gets put across intelligently in a good presentation. So the question is, how do you do that? We all know that it's very easy to get up there and talk about your strengths, but the key is, what do you do when the committee starts to raise questions? How do you make sure that those questions get responded to in an intelligent manner so they don't beget more questions? Because that's what we don't want. We don't want the piling on phenomena. We don't want a little bit of a fumble and everybody in the world starts to jump on it and see if they can't find the ball that leads you down. One of the great pieces of folks on committees like this, doesn't matter if it's at FDA or anywhere else, is everybody's looking to make their mark. It's a lot easier to make your mark in the negative space, find that mistake, find that error, find that question and raise it. We need to find a way to resist that temptation. We need to make sure it's easier for them to say yes than no. The way you do that is creating mini presentations. Usually I'll say 3 to 5 slides. It does depend on the data set, but we want to keep it to 3 to 5 slides. The way we do this, and this is the next step in the adjunct to our strategy, is to think through the questions. This is where, by the way, pre-advanced rehearsals and perhaps mock panels come into play. The way you do a mock panel, the best way to do a mock panel, it's not the only way, but in our experience it's the best way, is to take a look at the backgrounds of the people on the panel that you're going to be presenting to, and you'll generally know most of them in advance. And then go out and find folks who have the same background, maybe even from the same schools. I'm not talking about today, but the same educational backgrounds. Folks who are doing the same things. Put them in a mock panel and present to them. Listen to their questions. The beauty of that is you can fumble in a mock panel. But what you really want to know is, what are the issues they're going to raise? How has our strategy played into what it is they're going to say? You want to be able to think your way through so that if somebody raises a question on X, you can immediately say, hey, we have a response to that, and boom, pop that up. Do you always present that data? No, you do not. Does it remain buried if the issue doesn't surface? Oh, yes, it does. But if somebody says, you know, I'm a little concerned about the metabolite issue at 12 hours, and you've noticed that's come up in your mock panels, or FDA raised that more than once, then you best have an answer to respond to that. If you don't, then you ought to be honest and say, we really don't have an answer for that. We don't think it's of clinical significance if it isn't, but you need to have some response necessary for that. These mini presentations are how you stop the bloodbath. They're how you stop chinks from becoming up in your armor. They're how you stop everybody from piling on, because you have the response to them. You're right, sir. Here's the answer to your question. Let me just pop this up. And you know, the person who speaks to that obviously needs to be defined in advance as well. When you're thinking through your presenters, not necessarily your presenters are the ones who come up with those responses. In your rehearsals, you figured out maybe it's a pharmacokinetic question. I happen to like pharmacokinetics, so maybe this is how I would like to talk about them. So what you need is they raise a question and you say, you know what, Dr. So-and-so's in our office from our pharmacokinetic group. Let me bring him up here to respond to that. He or she pops up for their quick 2 to 5 minute slide. Maybe there's a third question or a fourth question that they respond to. Boom, they sit down. Hopefully the issue's done. Comes up, go right back to those slides. Is this where the presentation mechanics matter? Yes. But did you worry about that up front? No. That's when you wrote your strategy and your slides and began to think through what it is. Could you have more slides for these responses than you do for all your presentations? Absolutely. Is it possible you could put a lot of them together and never use them? That'd be the best outcome now, wouldn't it? I know a lot of folks would say, well, that's a lot of work. Yes. But getting to yes is worth a whole lot more than getting that no. If you spend a little bit of time extra to make sure you get there, you'll be a whole lot happier in the end. Let's take a moment here and talk about the presenters themselves. There's a lot of reasons you pick someone to be a presenter. It's not necessarily a function of the fact that they're the person who did all the work, the inventor of the product, the person who ran your company. No. The presenters have to be picked because of multiple attributes. For starters, they do have to know what you're talking about. But they don't always have to be members of your own company. True story. We were once running an advisory committee. We needed an outside expert in a particular field. The company had always used consultants for this. Their consultants that they were using maybe weren't the best people to do presentations. And so the consideration was made that we needed an outside expert. That outside expert had quite an extraordinary fee, but the company decided that even though it made very little sense if you looked at it in the narrow picture, but in the bigger picture of what the market viability of the product was, the one-day fee really wasn't that bad. We brought that person in, trained them, taught them the data, explained it to them, and made a big impact because they were a leader in their field. So that makes sense depending upon where you are. We have to have people who can speak well. It's not always that easy to do. They have to be understandable. They have to be comprehensible. They have to be able to speak in front of folks. There's an awful lot of people in this world who don't make great public speakers. Brilliant? Absolutely. Way smarter than me? Absolutely. But you know, it's not all that easy, for example, to do a webinar like this. It takes process. It takes time. Frankly, it makes me nervous every time I do it, but I've done it enough that I'm used to it. You have to make sure you have the same thing from the view of your presenters. They have to be somebody capable of thinking on their feet. They also have to be somebody who's willing to take the criticism as we go through the rehearsal process. Are they speaking too fast? Are they emphasizing the wrong slide? Are they missing a piece of data? We have to go through all of that with them. If you have somebody whose ego won't take that, they won't make that. Again, the sponsor team, though, must be led by you. Every presenter has to be responsive to what I call your internal charge d'affaires. Why do I call it that? Because they're in charge of the whole affair. The truth is, there's a major domo who manages this entire thing. They might not even be the key presenter, but they're the person who moderates internally. So when a question comes from the panel, This is the person who says, Dr. So-and-so will respond to this. This is the person who says, you know what, we have an answer for that. Let me bring in the right expert and let it talk to you. They're the one who responds to the panel first. It's not a free-for-all. It's not a dozen people waving their hands. It's one person who's in charge, knows exactly what to do, might even have a cheat sheet. 15, we anticipate the following 15 questions. Here's the following 15 people who can respond. Here's our expert. Here's it is. Now, do sometimes people use consultants for that? Sure. Frankly, I'd really rather it be a member of the company because I think it looks better. I am not the kind of guy who thinks the consultant should be front and center. It's your data. As the sponsor, you should have ownership of this, and the sponsor should lead the sponsor's team. There's just no doubt about that in my mind. I know that there are a lot of folks out there who see it differently, and frankly, I think they're wrong. I think they're actually quite confused about this. Since it's all about the strategy and all about the product, who owns that? The sponsor does. Who should be the person who puts that forth? The sponsor should be. Should the consultant be anywhere in evidence? Only behind the scenes. This is your show. It's not the consultant's show. It's the client's show. Let's talk about rehearsals. They take time and effort, but not as much time and effort as it took to get you here. Does that mean everybody has to spend 2 hours a day for 30 days to get there? Absolutely. I know of a company who did that. They dedicated themselves every single day. They had a rehearsal of their presentation till they had this down cold. And what happened? They walked in, they got the yes, boom, first product on the market. Great place to be. I'd say, by the way, that wasn't one of our clients for this. They were a client of ours for something else, but I noticed how diligently they dedicated themselves to this rehearsal, and I thought it was pretty impressive. Do you have to do it every day? That's debatable. A couple times a week? Absolutely. You have to think, and the only way to think your way through this, and we're all, thinking people in our industry, is to do it and think to yourself, what did I just say? What's the best way to say this? Is it flow off my tongue? It can't be something you do the weekend before your presentation. It just doesn't make any sense. You spend too much time and effort to get there. Unless FDA gives you 3 days and then you have to put together. But in general, we all know that doesn't happen. Be prepared to do more. Think in advance. This is a key part of your strategy. What are you going to be willing to accept, and what do you want to argue? If somebody on the committee were to say to you, would you be willing to do another clinical trial with, say, 100 patients to prove this? You might want to think through the answer to that and say, no, here's our data, here's why. You want to think that through. If somebody says, are you willing to do a post-market surveillance study? Well, you might be willing to do that. And so you can actually say, we've thought about that before, and we have some parameters around that, so that, again, you can own this. You don't want to be surprised. It's frequently obvious to me that a lot of folks have thought about how they get to the meeting. They haven't thought about what might occur at the meeting. And at the meeting, you may get, would you be willing to do X? Well, you may want to think about what that means and how you're going to get there, and if you're willing to accept it, because you're now in a discussive phase, which means it's perfectly okay not to argue, but to push back a little bit. You don't have to dive into anything you want. Like all good scientists, those folks are thinking too, and they may think this is interesting. You can actually say, it's not practical, or we don't know if this will work. As long as it's not a clinical safety issue, and if it is, you have to think about how you're going to deal with that. But the truth is, if you think someone's giving you an idea that's a bad idea, you should say it's a bad idea. Demonstrate your knowledge of this field. Demonstrate how you think your product will be used. No harm in doing that. On the other hand, if you're willing to take an extra study, or if you're willing to take an extra label analysis, or if you're willing to do some warning that you're willing to accept to get on the market and then worry about later, you might be willing to take that. You should signify that you are. Makes it a lot easier. If you can signal to the FDA that you're willing to do that, compromise is not a bad thing. It's not always necessary, and sometimes we can put up a defense against it, but sometimes it makes it easier to say yes. And again, as I've said multiple times, that's the goal and purpose of this. So in summary, let me just say this. Good science presented well wins. That's been the motto of the Weinberg Group for decades, and to tell you the truth, it's the same motto that works for our clients here. A well-conceived strategy that focuses on the good points, the high value of your data, the significance of your product, all of that will make a difference. You have to account for the committee's biases. We've talked about that, understand their background, put it into concept, and then bring in your response portfolios. Make sure the right presenters are there. Make sure the right presenters have the right presentations based again off your strategy. Recognize this is not easy. There will be tough questions. There's going to be tough issues or you wouldn't be in an advisory committee in the first place. So you best be prepared to answer them. Be smooth, be intelligent, and you cannot be too prepared. No matter what you do, you cannot be too prepared. It's like thinking that we're going to go into the Super Bowl having not even bothered to play a previous season. It makes no sense. Right? Or if we want to take this out of the sports analogy world, it's like thinking that Rembrandt painted a picture having never had a brushstroke. Well, I think we've all seen that some of the artists' early work not necessarily as great as their later one as they hone their craft. You need to be in a position of having honed craft. You need to really think through what you have, what it means, and how to present it intelligently. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to me. It's always a pleasure to talk to folks in our industry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Claire and see if we have any questions. Claire?
Okay, thank you, Matthew. This concludes the webinar. We have a number of questions, and the first is, what do we do if there is a significant hole in our data?
You know, this isn't that unusual a question. The truth is most products have something we don't know about them. But this is not new to you. You've known this from the beginning. You've known you had the hole, and let's face it, so does the agency. You might be willing to suggest a study post-market to examine that. You might be willing to accept a warning, or you might be willing to demonstrate, and this is again where the strategy comes into play, about why that hole doesn't matter. It may point it out to you, and if you have a 2 to 5 question slide answer to it, then you'll be better off. So what do you do if there's a hole? Cope with it. It's not a shock. You're not going to learn this at the last minute. You've always known. Figure out how to explain it. Not explain it away, just explain it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what do we do if we think the agency is not in favor of approval?
Well, that's always fun, isn't it? Luckily, this doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. Sometimes the FDA is not sure. There might be a debate. They're not really, positive, but it's a significant issue. It's an unmet need. It could be something like that. To the best extent possible, the way to deal with this is to try to figure out what FDA's objections are going to be and answer them yourself before they're raised by somebody else. This gets back to, again, and most of my answers will, the strategy, because I think that's where everything comes from. Figuring down and sitting down up front and figuring out what needs to be done allows you to counter this sort of stuff. If you know what the agency's objections are, be ready to put them down and respond to them before they get raised by somebody else.
Okay, great. I think we have time for about 2 more questions, and the next is, how do we handle the issue of a committee member presenting a competing product?
This is always a challenge. These are great questions. There are a lot of the committee members come in with their own biases. They've probably done clinical trials. They have some amount of knowledge in this area. And the truth is that one of them may say, what about this product? Well, one, you probably know the space you're in. You probably know the products you're in. You may not have thought this one through in advance. This is often one of those kind of problems you hadn't anticipated. But you have a smart person on your group, take a second, think, and respond. If you know something about the product, talk about it. If you don't know anything about the product, it's flat out easier to say, I don't know much about that product, but I'd like to talk about the strengths of ours. And this is where I always say sometimes, rarely, but every now and then there's value in thinking like a politician. A lot of politicians, in case you've never noticed, don't answer the question they're asked. This could be one of those times. Somebody raises a question about a product. You don't want to talk about that. Talk about your strengths. Talk about your value. You don't have to focus on somebody else's. If they're going to continue to hammer it, come up with a simple answer. You know what? We don't really know much about that product. We've been focusing on developing our own. We know what the strengths and weaknesses are. We haven't seen the data of somebody else's. Something like that will probably put that to rest.
Okay, good advice. The last question for today is, what do we do if one of the committee members is dead set against us?
Like walking in with FDA's against you. It's a bad spot. It depends on who the committee member is, and hopefully it's not the chair. The best thing to do, I sometimes find, is to turn this against them. And here's what I mean by that. We've all been in arguments before, we tend to get defensive. It's typically what happens when a panel member is against us. But the way to deal with this is to actually ask them what their objection is. Make them defend their objection. Ask them, I'm sorry, Dr. So-and-so, I'm really having trouble focusing on what it is your issue is. See if you can't break down their objection by asking them questions and bringing that through. It's a good reason, again, to do rehearsals because you can anticipate, make this up during your rehearsal. Have somebody be and argue with you. Practice having your moderator, again, why the sponsor should be the moderator, why the sponsor should know a lot about the product, to have the moderator ask those questions to say things like, I'm really having trouble understanding your objection. Can you help me with that? And then break down so that you can respond in pieces. And that's pretty much it. I understand we're out of time. I'd like to say thank you, Claire. I know we'll summarize, but thank you for taking the time to listen to me just go on and rant here. But I appreciate it.
Of course. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. Matthew will answer the remaining questions within the next week, and we will email them to you along with the slides. In addition, we would appreciate it if you could please take a minute to fill out the brief evaluation survey on the left side of your screen. Thank you for joining our presentation.